have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order.
Coming up this week,
there's a changing of the guard at NATO. Down comes the regimental banner of Jens Stoltenberg. Eyes right, salute the former Dutch PM Mark Rutte. Some say the treaty organisation has never been more relevant. But is that a bit like the man who jumps from the 23rd floor, still looking very well as he passes the third?
Meanwhile, a new OBR forecast accuses pensioners of placing too much burden on the British treasury, tripling the national debt by mid-century. At the same time, the Labour government is fast-tracking euthanasia through Parliament. Is Killer Keir's latest economic strategy just the day of the pillow?
Finally, there hasn't been a Trump assassination attempt for at least 48 hours. Unless there has by now, in which case, please ignore this message. What does the never-ending conga line of would-be nation-destabilisers say about the health of the US polity?
But first...
NATO no-no. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg is stepping down from his position. He will be replaced on October the 1st, by Mark Rutte, the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands. And on his way out, Mr. Stoltenberg has given an interview to Foreign Policy magazine, which is kind of the second magazine of the US foreign policy establishment. In this interview, I thought it was fascinating because he really encapsulated the Western foreign policy establishment's view of the world in many ways. But I think beyond that, he also, himself as a person, his career also encapsulates something extremely important about the way foreign policy has developed over the last generation or two. So on the first matter, on the interview itself, Mr. Stoltenberg was very clear that he sees NATO's position and role as global. His argument is essentially that everything is connected. He drew specific attention to the fact that North Korea is providing large amounts of ammunition to Russia to support Russia in its operations in Ukraine. And he therefore argues that NATO cannot simply concern itself with Europe. He also points to the fact that China is increasingly in the same camp as Russia. He says that they are aligned more closely than ever. Absent from this, though, is any admission that any actions by the West may have caused this. For instance, I think it's fairly clear that over the last 15 years or so, or even longer than that, since the late 1990s, NATO has applied pressure to Russian foreign policy interests. You might think that those foreign policy interests are illegitimate, but the Russians don't. And NATO, through its expansions and through its fairly vehement and consistent rhetoric that it doesn't particularly like Russian President Vladimir Putin, has indeed pressured Russia. At the same time, more recently, but at the same time, the US and the broader Western foreign policy establishment has been pressuring China. They're making it very clear, as we've spoken about many times on this podcast, that they will not allow China to develop economically in the way that it wishes. They've enacted a series of sanctions on China, specifically designed to cut China off from the high-tech sources of growth that it hopes to use to continue its economic expansion and its move up the value chain of manufacturing and improvement in living standards. The US has been quite clear that if it can stop that, it will. So at the same time that the Western foreign policy has been pressuring Russia, it's also been pressuring China. But there was a refusal to admit that these actions have actually pushed these two countries together. It's almost like they have decided, we'll just work together in a kind of anti-Western alignment. The exact quote is, his exact quote is, "It's because they align in standing of what they believe in a different world order." So what he's saying essentially is that Russia and China are essentially two regimes who want a different world order. Well, there's no admission at all that why they want a different world order, why they feel the current world order is not suited to them. I suppose what he's saying is that, they're both not neither country believes in kind of Jeffersonian liberal democracy. They don't necessarily believe in neoliberal economic tenets. Neither of them are very keen on selling off their national assets to multinational organizations and so on and so forth. And therefore, because of this, and because, they're both perhaps authoritarian nations compared with the West, although individuals in the West might have something to say about that, given the way the West is going. They found themselves together. There's a refusal to admit that it's Western policy that has, at least in part, helped drive these two countries together. And I think that this interview of Mr. Stoltenberg on the way out it encapsulates perfectly the Western view of the world, that basically, NATO is just acting in this, or not just NATO, but NATO, the EU, the overall West as individual nation states, and of course the most powerful of them all, the United States, is acting in this kind of higher moral realm. And any kind of disagreement is basically due to the fact that they hate us for some reason. They disagree with us. They want to overturn this perfect world. There's no concession really that their actions might have consequences. There's no concession that their actions might go against the interests of others, and therefore there's no there's no admission or no contrition about any mistakes that might have been made driving natural resources and nuclear superpower into the arms of the world's biggest economy and the world's manufacturing superpower. There's nothing at all. But I think in a more broad sense, Philip, if one looks at the career of Jens Stoltenberg, you really get a very nice, he's kind of like an exemplar, paragon of what's happened more broadly with Western foreign policy, certainly over the last 25 years, but probably close to the last 40. Now, Stoltenberg, was something of a princeling, or as close to a princeling as one can get in Norway. His father was, a powerful and well-respected politician. He was actually Norway's Minister of Foreign Affairs for, I think, 4 years between 1990 and 1993. And Stoltenberg himself, as a young man, was something of a leftist. He was associated in certain realms with, the sort of left-wing ideas that students get involved in, certain kind of Trotskyist groups and things like that. And as he got older, eventually he became NATO NATO Secretary General. This is the kind of the opposite of the old-fashioned left used to view things like NATO and US military power and the US intelligence services. Now, of course, famously, Seymour Hersh alleged in his huge Nord Stream investigative report that Stoltenberg had been involved with the US intelligence services from a very young age. Hersh alleged that he cooperated with the CIA on helping them identify individuals in the anti-Vietnam War protest movement in Norway. Other people have said, well, this is absolutely ridiculous because Stoltenberg would have been only 15 or 16 at the time. I think, though, that there's a much better explanation that he was a CIA asset from the start. And that's simply that the broader left, the kind of like the elite left, has moved in this direction. Like, why is that? Well, I think what's happened is that these people, like people who think in these terms, have never given up their utopian view of the world. They have never given up this idea of the grand project. But what they did was they gave up their kind of Trotskyist or, Marxist ideas of seizing the commanding heights of the economy and putting the means of production in the hands of the workers. And instead they started focusing on social issues. They started focusing on things like, minority rights, for example. They started focusing on a quite aggressive and expansionary form of liberalism. And I think what happened really is that the war on terror allowed them to find once again this kind of utopian crusade that we were going to bring liberal democracy and free trade and globalism and the benefits of cosmopolitanism to the world at the point of at the end of the gun barrel, essentially. And it was a kind of utopian crusade for them. And you see very much now that these people view their domestic politics with the same Manichaean kind of good versus evil view as they view international politics. At home, it's the far right, it's the Brexiteers, it's it's these kind of like unreconstructed working class racists. In America, that might be best described as the deplorables, as we heard from Hillary Clinton. And then abroad, they have the same kind of view, which is kind of like these states like Russia, like China, like perhaps Syria, or Iran, that stand in the way of the march forward of their glorious utopian project. And of course, in doing this, they found willing allies in America, which was taken over by the neoconservatives and the alum of the project of the New American Century, who also wanted to remake the world in America's image. We've spoken about this on the podcast before. So I think Stoltenberg really encapsulates this shift very nicely in his career, starting off as a kind of a student leftist activist, joining the Norwegian Labour Party, eventually becoming Prime Minister of Norway, and then becoming NATO Secretary General. And we've seen an intellectual shift of the left that's followed a very similar course over the same period of time as Stoltenberg's career has taken place.
Yeah, what you're describing is probably familiar to some people. It's neoconservatism. I mean, a lot of the neoconservatives were Trotskyist. Christopher Hitchens was probably the best known in Britain. He still, I think, to his dying days, said that he was a Trotskyist. I mean, I guess it became so flexible in the minds of those people that, they could pretty much justify anything. Nuclear war is Trotskyist or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I think it's as you describe it. The boomers grew up and the boomers became defenders of, the status quo in a sense, and they justified it to themselves by jumping through certain mental hoops or whatever. I think it's interesting to compliment Jens Stoltenberg's move, which I'll talk about in a moment, because he's not completely disappearing, with the ouster of Thierry Breton from the European Commission. Now, Thierry Breton has nothing much to do with foreign policy. He's recently been in the news because he was attacking Elon Musk and saying that the EU should fine Twitter out of existence or something. I don't know, some attempt to destroy the European tech industry further, because they seem to really not want the tech industry here, these people. Anyway, he's been ousted effectively by von der Leyen, who's coming in for another term as president of the Commission, and basically they don't like each other. If you read the articles on this, it's all internal gossip. Very boring, actually. There's no substantive disagreements that become apparent very quickly or anything. It's all just gossip. I'll come back to that in a moment, because I think it has a lot to say about the stakes of these institutions. But the Breton ouster is basically solidifying von der Leyen's power over the Commission. Now, of course, whereas in the past you may have been able to ignore the shadowy Commission figures and their president, just hear about them vaguely from time to time, if you're following foreign affairs these days, and I assume our listeners are, von der Leyen crops up again and again because she's turned the Commission presidency into some sort of a foreign policy tool. I don't know what you call it. It's a very vague entity, because in theory and in practice, or at least supposedly in practice, European states set their own foreign policy. There's no EU-wide foreign policy, but with the war in Ukraine, von der Leyen has kind of created the illusion, I would say, of an EU foreign policy. I'll get back to that illusion part in a minute as well. It feels to me like this might be the last ride of this crowd. As you alluded to earlier, this crowd are they're Atlanticists to the core, but I think it goes beyond that. I think what you're alluding to is true. I think the Trotskyists and these kind of left leftists, I guess, in a sense, began to identify with the ideals of American progressive liberalism and became very inured to the American way of looking at the world. And even, you'd see people like Hitchens and so on jump on with the regime change operations in Middle East with Saddam Hussein and stuff to try and bring this liberal progressive dreamland to Iraq. Of course, it doesn't work, but that is the vision that they had. And I think that vision in Europe is about to come to an end. Now, I'm saying that while I say that Ursula von der Leyen secures her power. Yes, of course, no doubt. My understanding is Breton is more of a kind of a French autonomist. Whether it matters or not, it probably doesn't, the position that he holds, but it's symbolic. You have Kaja Kallas, I think her name is, ex-president of Estonia, I think, has replaced Josep Borrell, who as the head of EU diplomacy. Borrell was a real diplomat. She's not. She's a anti-Russia kind of prime minister in a small country, very small country. And so it seems to me like all these ducks are lining up to get shot down because they're all lining up at the top at the very same time as the Ukraine situation is starting to collapse. That's not really speculation anymore. It's quite obvious. It's reported in the media now. And so all these people are thinking that they finally secured the spot. They've got rid of their Thierry Bretons, and Stoltenberg's being replaced, but I should say he's stepping into to the Munich Security Conference, which we can talk about in a moment very briefly. But at the same time as all these uber hawks, these kind of Trotskyist neoconservatives, I mean, they're not all. Von der Leyen, I don't think, was ever a Trotskyist. I think she comes from the more conservative side, but they all agree on everything. They're coming at the same time as you're kind of seeing interviews and so on bounce around Europe with former figures, but very prominent figures. I saw one that was mainly on the Gaza conflict with Dominique the other day, who was the former French Prime Minister of France under Jacques Chirac, and he was also Minister of Foreign Affairs. He's a very prominent figure in Gaullist politics in the kind of Chirac orbit, and he's definitely of the old school autonomous, the type that kept France out of the Iraq War. And he's talking about Gaza and he's talking about this and that. But really the subtext of what he's saying is Europe don't control their own foreign policy, and that's dangerous. And my understanding is everyone blames that on von der Leyen and her clique, which probably includes Stoltenberg as well. I'm not sure about that, but my sense would be that's the case. And I think this is their war. And when this war is lost, there'll be pretty strong push to blame it on these people and to get rid of them and to bury them politically, potentially forever. Just one last thing on where Stoltenberg's going. He's going to the Munich Security Conference. You've probably heard that term before because Putin's given some very spicy speeches at that, which kind of led up, now logically looking back on it retrospectively, it led up to the Ukraine war. But the Munich Security Conference itself, I mean, let me just tell you who Stoltenberg is replacing. He's replacing Christoph Heusgen, a German diplomat, and the former chairman's called Wolfgang Ischinger. Like, you've never heard of these people. I mean, I'm not insulting them. I'm sure Christoph Heusgen is a good diplomat or whatever. But you've never heard of any of these people. And that kind of is how it feels with a lot of these kind of Atlanticist institutions, that really themselves are not really that important until there's a conflict and you have to push somebody up to the top. But, they're kind of a holding pen. And in the past, when kind of NATO had a function in Europe and, it was relatively stable and there was no war, that holding pen could last indefinitely and you could cycle people through into the various key positions, as it were. But I think after the Ukraine war, all that is going to collapse because at the same time, America is going to pull back from Europe, as we say multiple times on the show. And as I say to anybody I talk to who deals with these issues, and the response that I get from the people who oppose it is, yeah, America's going to collapse. And then you kind of go, well, what's going to happen next? And they don't really know. So they're very confused, but they kind of recognize that it's going to happen. So I think like watching this, Stoltenberg's out, Mark Rutte is in. It's another one of these guys from that holding pen, as it were. I know he was just prime minister, but it kind of works that way. And then he's gone over to Munich Security Conference, and Ursula von der Leyen has clipped the wings of, Borrell as well. It was the same kind of takedown as an independent diplomat, and she's also got rid of Thierry Breton. But it may look like they're strong, but they're not. I think it's just that nobody with any sense wants to be near the Ukraine grenade when it goes off. And I think when it goes off, it's going to take out everybody around it. And this is something optimistic from the Multipolarity podcast. I think at that stage, Europe move to get their foreign policy back under European control?
I wish I could be so optimistic, Philip. My feeling is that the Atlanticist power group within Europe is solidifying its control over both Europe's, like the EU's, and individual national power structures to an ever greater extent. One great example of that was that even though the populist parties, some of whom, to be fair, are kind of in favour of Atlanticism, but many of whom are more sceptical of it and would fall into what we on Multipolarity call the autonomists camp, i.e. those who want the EU to have an autonomous foreign policy rather than holding on to the coattails of the US's pursuit of its strategic interests. So even though this group of populists made really significant gains in the European Parliament, the centrist groupings, both centre-left and centre-right, who ostensibly are opponents and would traditionally switch positions as kind of, government and opposition, both national and in the EU, they just got together and kind of stitched up all the positions for people like Kaja Kallas, for people like Ursula von der Leyen. And I see no evidence at the moment that the autonomists have been able to make any gains commensurate with their gains in both opinion polling and national elections. They've, in fact, the opposite is happening. The Atlanticists are solidifying their control over the power structures within the EU. And I think America, like Washington, D.C. in general, has far greater control over individual European states than it ever had, even during the Cold War. It seems to have solidified that to an ever greater extent. My concern would be, I agree with you, eventually the United States is going to have to withdraw from Europe in order to shift its limited resources towards the great battle for the Western Pacific, which will ultimately be the center of global economic gravity for the 21st century. They'll have to shift resources into that theater to deal with the rise of China, and that will leave Europe somewhat naked and alone. And my general view is that Europe will have to think about what it's going to do strategically, and at that stage, some form of strategic autonomy becomes almost inevitable, or certainly necessary given the circumstances. Furthermore, the efforts that Europe, or the consequences of Europe's efforts to align itself with US foreign policy will become ever clearer. We're already increasingly seeing deindustrialization, most prominently in Germany, the powerhouse of Europe's manufacturing and industry, but also other nations as well. We're also seeing Europe cutting itself off from certain key avenues of trade with China, upon which it has relied for economic growth in the last decade or so. Again, most prominently with the Netherlands, with the producer of the ASML, the producer of the very highly precise lithographic machines used for printing semiconductors. And, we're seeing these things becoming ever more prominent. So, my general theory has been that ultimately, as the US withdraws and forces Europe to think for itself, and as the consequences of aligning with American strategic interests become more clear, indeed, the autonomists will start to make gains. But my concern is, and my kind of pessimistic view, is that the Atlanticists will maintain such a grip over the levers of power within Europe, which, as we've discussed on the podcast before, are really significant. As we've seen with the kind of the threats against France, the soft coup against Berlusconi in Italy, and the installation of Draghi, and the way that they've been able to bend Giorgia Meloni to their will, and the pressure that Hungary comes under, even though it's not a member of the Euro, which is probably what's allowed it to maintain some sort of autonomy. These levers are really extraordinarily powerful, especially when you combine them with the kind of the more nebulous grouping of NGOs and media figures, which are largely under Atlanticist control. And I fear that even when Europe is in a position where it must think autonomously, even when it does become apparent the kind of extreme economic costs that Europe faces from, it should be apparent already, by the way, with losing Russian pipeline gas, which is economically the most rational source of energy for Europe. But, when it becomes ever more apparent and the populists make ever more gains in the polls, I fear that the grip of power, the grip on the levers of power by the Atlanticists will be too strong to wrest free. The youth in Asia.
So this week and last, we had two stories that are not joined together in the public consciousness, but I fear that over time they will be. First one was last week. We got an OBR report, that's the Office of Budget Responsibility in Britain. They do all the economic forecasts. They're nominally independent, but they're sort of just the treasury. They're sort of the souped up treasury forecasts, and they're not really forecasts at all. They're actually a blueprint for long-term treasury planning. That's what the OBR effectively is. And I would say this latest report, or at least the prominence that was given within the various aspects of the OBR models, was a little bit different from before. So two things stand out. First of all, they said basically that on the current trajectory, the British debt is going to triple by 2070. It's going to go from about 170% in GDP up to just over 270%. So Japanese territory, effectively. And tied to that is the main driver of this, or one of the main drivers of this, is an aging population. This is all true. This is absolutely true. My co-author and I, Paul Moreland and I, have actually been working on some similar issues, and this is all but inevitable. The other takeaway from that report, just in case listeners didn't see it, is that the OBR projects that there'll be 315,000 net migrants into Britain a year, and that's just to get to the tripling of the debt. So anyone who thinks that stopping boats in the English Channel is going to stop migration has another thing coming. British migration, as in much of the world, is tied to demographic problems, and unless you address the demographic problems, the immigration will never be addressed. So the second story is that the Labour government is going to try, I won't go into the mechanisms how they're going to do it, but they're going to try and push through euthanasia. They're going to try and make euthanasia, that is assisted dying, illegal in Britain, much like it's been made legal in Canada, which has been extremely controversial. Now, why am I tying the two stories together? Because, let's put it this way. Usually when you have a debate about euthanasia or assisted dying, it's a very emotional debate. And it's a debate about rights, human rights and so on. Should you be allowed to take your granny's life if she's really in pain and all this? And that's all great. I mean, you can have those debates till the cows come home. Everyone has an opinion because it's kind of a simple debate, really. It's a moral debate. But isn't it kind of... That debate takes place in a sort of an economic and a social vacuum. It's an assumption that, there's no big deal. There's no pressure on anybody to, get any resources optimized or anything like that. The only thing that you have to focus on is this singular issue. You're in pain, you're, whatever. And then, you make a decision on that, or should the state be allowed to make a decision on that? But the issue is that if you have a treasury that is saying, unless we do something about tripling of the debt, unless we do something about the aging population, we're going to triple our debt by 2070, and we're already factoring in immigration levels that the population would not vote for and probably consider, in fact, definitely consider way too high. And then the government is coming out with a euthanasia plan. Use your imagination. I'm not saying that this is a plot. I don't think it is a plot. I don't think there's anyone sinister enough, even in the Treasury, to, plot to murder a bunch of old people. But what is happening here is that Britain is going into a phase of austerity. We talked about this in the show before. We, in fact, predicted it. I think we're some of the first people to be talking about this in public. But Britain's going into a phase of austerity that is not 4 or 5 years. When Keir Starmer comes out and says, we have to get through the hard times, we have to impose a bit of austerity and come out, light at the end of the tunnel, and we'll grow again. We're healing the economy. None of that's true. That is not what the OBR is saying. That's not what the Treasury is saying. They are not saying we're going to impose this austerity and in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, even 10 years, we're going to come out and the economy is going to be healed and we're going to bounce back and everyone's going to be happy again. They are laying out a very bleak picture for the future, right up to 2070, a 50-year plan of managed decline for Britain. At the same time, as the 50-year managed decline plan for Britain is being laid out, you have a Labour government
by the way, run by two civil servants, Rachel Reeve of Bank of England and Keir Starmer, former Crown Prosecution Services, head of the Crown Prosecution Service, two former civil servants that are running the country as a cost-cutting exercise. So just to give one example, they let a bunch of criminals out of jail. Again, I don't really want to get into the morality of that. They are letting them out because there's, quote-unquote, not enough space in prisons. There's no money. So the state is broke, and they are looking at cost-cutting measures. At the same time, a euthanasia bill is coming through Parliament. I think you probably are going to have to start tying these things together. The NHS is a public body. It has limited resources already. It will be starved further and further of resources as this austerity bites. Tax revenues will fall, just as the OBR is projecting. And the NHS will put the pressure will be put on the NHS to cut costs. And the way that they look at life care effectively is through QALYs, which we may have heard about in the lockdown, which is, I can't remember the exact meaning of the acronym, but it's basically kind of quality of life adjusted years of people's existence or whatever. That's how the NHS already looks at these things. And for many reasons, public healthcare systems have to look at things through QALYs and related metrics. But if you introduce a euthanasia element to that, and then you massively impose cost restrictions on that system, the bureaucracy will do everything it can to cut costs. And I think that could go in a very scary direction. We're already seeing something similar happen through private medical care in Canada, because Canada, I think it's got a public option, but it also has an American-style private medical care layered on top of that. And it looks to me, and people have commented on it, like the insurance companies are definitely kind of, I'm not saying they're pushing anyone to self-euthanize, but they are definitely putting that option on the table. And it's very attractive to the insurance companies because it's much cheaper than more surgery or more care. Chronic conditions are particularly expensive for insurance companies. Insurance companies are obsessed with trying to detect something like multiple sclerosis early on so that they don't have to insure you and so on. But that's under a private system. Britain is a public system. It's a public system that's going broke. The entire country's now, apparently, according to the Treasury, OBR, it's broke for the next 50 years. And at the same time, we've got this kind of technocratic government that's coming in and it's ruling in a kind of dark way. Like, it's not kind of technocratic insofar as it wants to make the roads better and give you things and say that it can optimize your life. It's a technocratic government that's coming in and going, we're out of money and we want to save resources. So, I mean, honestly, I must say, I'm not trying to be partisan here, but I had very low expectations of the Starmer government. We said early on that this was going to be a hardcore austerity government. We were right about that. But I have to say, the Starmer government is taking darker and darker turns quicker and quicker than I ever thought possible.
Yeah, I mean, this is an incredibly emotive subject. It's one that my family, had to navigate fairly recently, and I understand that people on both sides of this argument find it very emotive. I remember many years ago, Lord Jonathan Sumption was one of the great minds of contemporary Britain, was accosted by an extremely emotional lady who harangued him for his position that euthanasia should not be legalized. And he was retired at the time, so he could be quite honest and say that in his view, the only solution is to keep it illegal, but to turn a blind eye if it's quietly ignored every now and again. That's how difficult it is a subject to unravel, and it is emotive. But I really think you might be onto something here. I think I read when you and I first started doing this, or even before when we first got in touch online, Philip, I read one of your older articles from like maybe as long as 10 years ago. You were talking about the aging problem and how ultimately it might lead to governments legalizing euthanasia. And when I read that, it made perfect sense to me because it's human nature. Again, I want to emphasize what you did, that it's not human nature to think so cynically and in such a kind of ruthless utilitarian way that, like, look, our population's getting old, we need to cull them. No, that's not how they think. But things like this suddenly become kind of appealing and you kind of justifiable in people's minds when these problems hit. It's like the way I might describe it, and I don't mean to be vulgar here, but years ago, one of my friends was dating an extremely attractive woman, like massively attractive woman. And she wasn't really a great conversationalist, I have to say. Like, when we met her, she didn't have much to say. She didn't seem like the most interesting person in the world. But he was convinced that she was, great company, like a great conversationalist. And we all said, well, maybe it's got something to do with the fact that she's fabulously good looking, right? I mean, and, you see the same sometimes with, these kind of Silicon Valley billionaires who are, they look and talk and sound like absolute deathly boring nerds. And yet they find themselves with these extremely attractive women who suddenly, what is it about these billionaires do these women find attractive? Now, not all of these women, contrary to popular myth, are kind of gold diggers, but it kind of helps you find somebody attractive if they have certain aspects. And I think in a much less vulgar way, I think this is the kind of the aspect of human nature that's going on here with regard to the spread of euthanasia, first from Belgium, and then, of course, Switzerland has had it for many years, but, more recently Belgium and then Canada, and now it seems increasingly likely the UK as well. And certainly from the stories that we're hearing in Canada, which also, I believe, has a single-payer healthcare system, about some of the pressure that depressed people, injured people, disabled people, old people have been placed on by doctors to kind of agree to be euthanized. It should at least raise some concerns that something similar might happen in Britain. But I suppose your view, Philip, is that a lot of these kind of mega trends are explainable by plain economic circumstances. So in the same way that you think that perhaps euthanasia will become more appealing to people as they sense in their bones that the burden of an older population is becoming too great for them to handle, or great enough for them not to want to handle it. You wrote a really interesting short column for Unheard recently, in which you said that migration is going to increase, like the civil service, the OBR, and the government are all trying to prepare the general public in Britain for permanently higher levels of migration. And you argued in the story that, look, Britain has an aging population. It's going to have ever fewer workers within the population to deal with an ever larger cohort of the population that needs expensive state support, and that will necessitate migration. But I recently read a study, perhaps released on the same day, that said that the solution for this low-cost migration to work in nursing homes and to take care of infirm old people's toilet visits and washing and showering and make sure that they're safe and fed and all the rest of it, that actually costs the state money. There was a study recently done by a group of British think tankers and politicians that said that actually low-paid migrant workers, the sort of people who come across to populate nursing homes, actually end up costing the taxpayers £150,000 each by the time they hit state pension age. And obviously that will massively increase if they then qualify to claim a state pension. In fact, the Office of Budget Responsibility in the UK, which is the British equivalent of the Congressional Budget Office, said that the estimated cost to the public purse would rise to £500,000 if they lived till 80, and over £1 million if they lived to 100. So, I mean, my argument is that perhaps some of these things aren't, another solution to an older age population is to bring in masses of young migrants willing to work for low pay, but maybe that ends up being worse than not having them at all.
Yeah, I really want to address that argument. I think we need to write something on it. I will yield to no one in thinking that the OBR's vision, plus a little euthanasia on the side, is like a hellscape. I mean, I think the British state is moving toward a hellscape state, and it really is tumbling there quite quickly, and it's scary. And I think migration levels, I think we've discussed it on the show before, beyond what we have now are going to politically destabilize the country. I can't believe civil servants can't factor that into their utility calculations or whatever. But I still think we need to be realistic about this debate, because the only way to get people in Whitehall to take you seriously, or any civil service around the world, is to make the debate in the terms that they are making the debate. And there is a serious error here, and I don't know why the British think tanks keep doing this. The ones that put out these statistics on migrants costing more for taxpayers or whatever. Because there's two variables here, okay? So if you're measuring debt, you're measuring debt to GDP, yeah? Debt divided by GDP, debt over GDP. So there's two variables. And it is true that probably, I mean, I haven't done the studies myself, but assuming that the methodology is correct and stuff, and I have no reason to think it's not, the migrants probably do cost more, as in they cost the taxpayer more. So they are adding to the debt variable. But here's the kicker. They're raising the GDP variable by significantly more. And in that way, they bring down the debt. That's how the treasury calculation is done. And I would really warn any listeners who are arguing against this in Britain or anywhere else. Treasury and OBR hire a lot of economists. They can hire out of places like Oxford and Cambridge. These are usually pretty good people. I'm not saying they're always the most creative people on the planet, but they are competent economists. They've probably thought of stuff like that. So you're not going to win on that basis. So in this case, the debt is going up, but the GDP is going up significantly more. How much more? I don't know. But like at a guess, I'd imagine it's like 5 times more, 6 times more, 7 times more. It's not even measurable. The distance between them is so large that there's no way you'd make the argument. The issue is that the migrants are being brought in to keep the GDP pie growing. And then they'll say, oh, well, it's not growing. Yes, but without the migrants, it shrinks. Okay? That's what aging populations do. Like, aging populations are an absolute hell on earth economically. And so what the migrants are ultimately doing is they're coming in, filling the jobs, at least keeping the population stable and keeping things relatively ticking over. And if you subtract them from the equation, the GDP goes down while the debt continues to go up, and you have an absolute explosion. That's what these treasury models are saying. So if anyone wants to address any of these points, demographic points, euthanasia points, immigration points, you have to factor all this in. Start from the assumption that the OBR are probably correct in their utilitarian terms. And the real criticisms that need to be made are, first of all, from the euthanasia point of view, do we really want quality life-adjusted quantitative measures of what our lives are worth dictating if medical care is doled out or a euthanasia pod is offered? And for migration and so on, what I would really try and point out to these civil servants and those around them and the politicians is, your equations are all well and good, but you haven't factored in social instability at all. And social instability can completely destroy a society and an economy. I just want to make the point, very briefly, that the place with all the social and ethnic instability in Britain currently is Northern Ireland. It's calmed down recently, for now, thankfully. But it's had social and ethnic instability for a long time, and especially since probably the late 60s and early 1970s. Last time I looked, Northern Ireland has roughly the same living standards as an Eastern European country, and it's in Britain. So just take that into account, bureaucrats, if you're going to start introducing those kind of tensions into a society. That's what could happen.
The weeks of the Jackal.
So, another assassination attempt on presidential candidate and former President Trump. That's 2. In a presidential campaign. I think that's a record. The media definitely paid attention to it. Did they pay as much attention as a second assassination attempt merited? Probably not. We'll talk about that in a moment. Very abnormal things appear to be becoming more and more normalized in America, and it's a very, very scary trend because it shows a level of civilization slipping away, in a sense. We might talk about that in a moment, but I think the real geopolitics and multipolarity takeaway from this is that the alleged assassin is a Ukraine lunatic. I don't mean that derogatively of everybody who supports Ukraine. I'm sure most people who support Ukraine are completely normal people, and even most people who support the war and everything like that, I'm sure they're all normal. But this guy was not normal. This guy was a weirdo. He's a fanatic, clearly. He was recruiting out of Afghan for volunteers. He was visiting, I guess, on his own dime, Ukraine. I think he was like a construction worker, or he ran a small construction company or something. So, like, he had no apparent connection to these issues. I watched one of the kind of like videos he made. Like, his understanding of foreign policy was like, I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase from Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist, that is not only not right, it is not even wrong. I mean, that's how it came across when I was listening to this guy. Like, he doesn't seem to even know what the correct alliance structures are in the world. And, like, he just has this. It's almost a conspiracy theorist. That's how he came across when I was watching him. But anyway, he's a nut. There's no doubt about that. But he was really into the Ukraine thing, and newspapers, I think New York Times interviewed him, and there was an interview with him, a video interview with Newsweek and so on. So clearly he was kind of kicking around these like hardcore pro-Ukraine circles, and like mainstream journalists via like, you know, hardcore pro-Ukraine group goes to Kiev for a visit to Maidan Square, and the journalists run into them and they start talking to these people. Anyway, one of these guys has taken a shot at Trump. Look, we don't know the motivations yet, but it's not really that hard to guess that it was probably due to the fact that Trump keeps saying he's going to end the war in Ukraine. And, you know, there's a lot to say about this, but the first thing to say about this is the blowback now from foreign policy in America is becoming really, really scary. We're way beyond, like, soldiers coming back from PTSD. We're at the point now where the foreign policy that's being done abroad is blowing back in the form of major interference in political campaigns, up to and including trying to kill one of the candidates. And that just seems to me to be a whole new level of blowback. And that ties into kind of what I was saying earlier, that America's starting to feel really unstable. Like, how would you analogize this? If you start to accept highly abnormal behavior, I don't know, from a spouse or a coworker or whatever, if you like go into a situation and you start tolerating ever more abnormal behavior from another person and justifying it to yourself every time, and your life soon will presumably just be chaos, right? You'll just be like, everything's nuts every day, and everybody else on the outside looking in is like, whoa, your life is really nuts. Like, why do you live like that? And it's like, my life's not nuts, it's fine. But you kind of got yourself there. And it feels like America's going the same way. Like, I don't know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, if there was an attempted assassination, it would have been like a big thing in the election campaign. The initial one with Trump came out, we got those pictures, we got a day or two's coverage, and it was put under the rug. And now we've got a second one, because there wasn't the mass condemnation, because there wasn't the constant hammering of like, we don't accept that in this country. We've got a second one now. And it looks like, I mean, it's only been 2 days, but it looks like the media is going to go in the same direction. And so it feels like America as a country is starting to tolerate more and more abnormal behavior in its political system and so on. And that won't end well. It really won't, because I think we're getting very close to the day when you just look around and you're in America and you're in the American politics or whatever, and you're like, this place is a madhouse. It's not just like partisan divide anymore. It's like assassination attempts are day to day now, or like pretty normal, or political violence is normal. How'd you get to this place? Because you allowed yourself step by step to walk into it. And it feels really, really like America's moving there right now. And it's really scary. And of course it comes out of the partisan thing. It wouldn't exist if it didn't. But you can still have a really divided partisan society and try and put a stop to this kind of political violence. But there doesn't seem to be any appetite for it. And so, you know, the general consensus of people I talk to is like, it'll probably continue. If it continues, it'll get worse. And the last thing to say about that is, sure, we live in the West, and maybe we like can tolerate the weirdness, and it hasn't spilled over to Europe. Hopefully it won't. We saw some indications with the Fico assassination, which we talked about in a similar vein recently, but there hasn't been anything else since then, thank God. Seemed to be an anomaly for now. But we can kind of ignore what's going on in America, sure, and like, okay, well, we're still kind of part of their whole global arrangement or whatever. We just kind of ignore it and hope it's okay or whatever. But the point is, like, the rest of the world is watching America, and there are big global changes going on. Obviously, the podcast is called Multipolarity for a reason. If America continues to tolerate this stuff, if it's like, oh, it's just another assassination attempt, every other country's going to look over there and be like, it's a failed state. And the thing is, if everyone around you starts to think you're a failed state, you might start to become a failed state. So I really hope America gets it together. But this week, the indications I've seen from this second attempt is rather than the media saying, oh man, having a second attempt, that's worse than the first attempt. We should pay more attention to that to make sure it never happens again. They're more so saying like, oh, another murder attempt. Guess we'll move on to the next story because that's boring.
Yeah, a lot to cover there on the alleged assassin himself. Many years ago, I think like 15 years ago, me and a couple of buddies went to visit Minsk in Belarus on a kind of lads adventure for a long weekend. And on a kind of guided tour of the city there, we actually stopped beneath and looked up to Lee Harvey Oswald's flat in Minsk. And reading the biography of the shooter, or the wannabe shooter of Trump at the golf course, there's a certain aspect of Lee Harvey Oswald to him. People probably know that Oswald was in the U.S. Marine Corps, and then he decided to defect to Russia. And after the KGB made sure that he wasn't some sort of kind of plant that the US, that the CIA had sent there, they packed him off to Minsk to work in a radio factory, and eventually got bored and tired of this and moved back to the US, and in New Orleans fell in with a whole bunch of kind of sinister and weird characters who had some quite interesting ideas, shall we say, and interesting contacts, and ended up being pretty famous for assassinating John F. Kennedy. And there's something about the current shooter that kind of matches with that. This kind of, his past criminality, the fact that he rushed off to Ukraine to try to be part of this great moral cause, the fact that he'd written this kind of, poorly formed and ill-considered, quite rambling 200-page story about his ideas on politics and foreign policy and the Great Crusade in Ukraine. And, then he's come back to the US and fallen in with God knows whom, and then, ended up at, trying to take a pop and failing at Trump. I don't think he's quite as sinister as Oswald himself, but history does, after all, repeat, first as a tragedy, then as a farce. And I very much get that impression here. But, quite apart from this lone wolf, as you say, the Ukraine connection is interesting, because I've always feared that Ukraine and our support for Ukraine, if it doesn't work out 100% in the way that some of the more ardent Ukrainians themselves might wish for, that we might end up with our very own Mujahideen in Europe. People know that the US support for the Mujahideen kind of created a monster, although some of them went on, people like Massoud went on to try to govern Afghanistan. The rest, a lot of the West end up, forming militia groups, including the Taliban, which, as we know, ended up being a great enemy of the United States. And I fear that there might be something similar, but instead of being locked away in the Hindu Kush, in a kind of a mountainous and inaccessible country, we might end up with that right on the doorstep of Europe, on the North European plain and Pontic steppe. And it's very easy to imagine a situation in which Ukraine is forced to sue for a suboptimal peace from its perspective, especially if it's worse than the one that was rejected, than the offer that was rejected in Istanbul in the spring of 2022, and something of a Dolchstoßlegende, a kind of stab in the back theory, emerging in Ukraine among these, pretty hardened, hardcore nationalists with combat experience and a kind of a certain perspective on life. And it's quite possible to imagine that kind of blowback coming into Europe and affecting it. A lot of them had already made contacts and maintained contacts with far-right organizations in Europe. Borders, because of refugee status and because of the Schengen Agreement and because of things like family reunion rules, will remain porous for a long time into the future. So you're right to be concerned about that. And although this has been an issue for America, I think it's an even greater issue for the European Union and Europe more broadly, especially those countries which perhaps haven't been as full-throated in their support of the Ukraine crusaders as certain Ukrainians might have liked. On the final point, I think you're 100% right about the state of politics in America at the moment. As regular listeners will know, I try to be quite assiduous in avoiding US politics. I think we take far too much heed of their domestic politics in the United Kingdom. The general British people are far too interested in, I don't know, like arguments about US healthcare policy. I think it's ridiculous. It's none of our concern. Foreign policy is a different matter, of course. But anyway, even I can tell that politics in the US has become almost hysterical and so polarized in the last kind of 20 years. There was evidence of it, I think, as far back as Clinton and some of the fringe hysteria on kind of talk radio and elsewhere about his background, and then there certainly was from the left when it came to Bush, and then it got even worse with Obama from the right, and then it just went through the roof when Trump was elected. It was almost unbelievable, and I think that's continuous, becoming more and more of an issue. And like, these things are important. Like, I'm back when I was a little bit more interested in American politics. I read about the caning of Charles Sumner. Like, Charles Sumner was a senator, and he'd made a particularly caustic and strongly worded speech against slavery he made a speech in Congress against slavery, not a speech against slaves being kept in Congress. But he made that speech, and then a couple of days later, he was attacked by the cousin of somebody another congressman, who he'd criticised. He was beaten half to death in the Congress. The caning, look it up, the caning of Charles Sumner. And events like that are indicative of a country that's falling apart at the seams. You can tell in America now that the two sides of the political debate no longer view each other as opponents, but enemies, and actually often enemies of the state. You actually hear this spoken about both on the left and the right. I mean, Donald Trump recently put out a big kind of scare advert of senior Democratic figures, including people like Hillary Clinton, talking in this kind of language, that that Republicans, and Donald Trump in particular, are fundamentally incompatible with America itself. Like, they're a danger to the state. And to be fair, I think Republicans would view some Democrats in exactly the same way. And this is indicative of a nation falling apart, or slowly becoming ungovernable. Now, eventually, in the 1850s, when Charles Sumner was at the 1850s, eventually America fell into a civil war not long after that, and eventually recovered to become a great nation, and in fact the most powerful nation in the world. I'm not saying that America's heading for civil war again, although some people are, and there's been a big movie about that recently. And I'm not saying that it would be able to recover this time if it does become ungovernable, even if it doesn't go as far as civil war. But, these things are important indicators of something that's going extremely wrong indeed. And I think for those people who say, well, you know, assassinating presidents or trying to assassinate presidents is just something that Americans do. Yeah, it is. I mean, like, I always look with horror at the kind of, you know, the how commonplace gun violence is, and you know how attacked presidents have been in the past, but you know, I think it's obviously worse this time to anybody who, you know, I think sometimes I find it easier because I do look from afar. I'm not involved at all. I don't have skin in the game, and it's just obvious to me that it's like way more. Way more polemicized, you know, way more angry. It's almost like a fever pitch of hysteria at the moment. And I think it's very dangerous indeed. You're right to say that the country could become, in theory, ungovernable. I think it's also possible that, you know, America has such awesome latent power that it can get through this. But I don't think any other country could, you know. So, yeah, I think you're right to say that, Phil Pilkington. I think this latest attempt on the life of Donald Trump should not just be seen in those terms. It should be seen as something that's bigger and more dangerous.